Hey guys, tonight we will delve into the tragedy of Anne Boleyn. The love story that changed all of England ended with a grievous death sentence. Can you dare to believe it? This is the sorrowful journey of a queen. From the pinnacle of ultimate power, Anne Boleyn was overthrown and imprisoned in just 17 short days. The woman whom King Henry VIII defied all laws to marry now became a rejected traitor, accused of incest and adultery by the very husband she loved most, and political enemies like Thomas Cromwell. Tonight, we will trace every mark of that sudden downfall, feel her utter loneliness at the dinner table, the cold indifference of her own family members, and the humiliation of being escorted down the River Thames under the contemptuous gaze of the public. This is a bitter and harsh slice of history, the desperate cry of a woman caught in a maelstrom of power. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please share with me what inspired you to join tonight, and what time it is at your location right now. Let the stillness and sorrow of this story gently carry you into a deep sleep. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Every year, on the 19th of May, when London is just beginning to soften into evening, a quiet ritual takes place inside the stone walls of the Tower. In the small chapel, where footsteps echo and candles burn with a low, steady light, a bouquet of red roses is delivered by someone who never leaves a name. No grand announcement, no card, no signature. Only a simple request accompanies the flowers: that they be laid on the exact spot where the second wife of Henry VIII, Queen Anne Boleyn, was buried after her execution on the 19th of May, in the year 1536. The roses are always red. Their colour glows gently against the pale stone floor, a small pool of life in a place built for imprisonment and death. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the layers of time folding over one another, the clang of armour from long ago, the murmur of Latin prayers, the soft weeping of those who once knelt here in mourning. Now there is only silence, broken by the rustle of petals as the bouquet is set down over Anne's resting place. It is a gesture as mysterious as it is faithful, repeated year after year, as if someone in the present is still keeping a private promise to a queen lost to the past. Into this hush steps a woman with calm eyes and a historian's patience. She introduces herself simply, Tracy Borman, a student of Tudor history, someone who has spent much of her life tracing the shadows of Anne Boleyn across documents, letters, and fading ink. But this time, she explains, she will not be looking at Anne only through parchment and paper. Over the next 3 nights, she is going to walk where Anne once walked, move through the same spaces, breathe the same heavy air, and follow, hour by hour, the path that led from a throne to a scaffold. She tells us that she will focus on 3 days, the 3 most important days of Anne's final chapter. The day she was arrested, the day she was tried, and the day she was executed. 3 days, each carrying its own weight of dread, confusion, and decision. From adored queen to discarded wife, from the highest honour in England to the cold floor of the chapel beneath the Tower, Anne's fall did not happen in vague legend, but in real hours, ticking away one after another, while the world around her kept spinning as if nothing had changed. Tracy promises not just to retell the story, but to follow Anne's footsteps as closely as the surviving evidence allows. To stand where Anne stood, to look at the doorways she passed through, the river she sailed along, the stones that watched her without mercy. She will move slowly, almost gently, as if trying not to disturb a sleeping memory, letting us watch Anne's downfall unfold in quiet, measured breaths rather than loud, sudden shocks. This is not a tale shouted over drums and trumpets, but a story unrolled like a long, worn tapestry, thread by thread. The first episode, she explains, will be devoted entirely to Anne's last day of freedom. It is a day that begins like any other, with morning light and familiar routines, and ends with chains that cannot be seen but are already tightening around her life. It is also a day that marks a grim first in English history. For the very first time, a Queen of England will be arrested and taken to the Tower as a prisoner, facing charges that carry the penalty of death. No queen before Anne had stood in that place, caught between a crown and a sword, knowing that either one might fall at any moment. As Tracy speaks, the camera of our imagination turns slowly around the chapel. We see the stained glass, soft and dim in the evening light. We see the worn flags hanging above, the wooden pews polished by centuries of hands. We see the stone slab beneath which Anne lies, unmarked by her face, her voice, or her story, carrying only her name and the date of her death. The red roses lie quietly on top, their scent almost like a whisper, a small defiance against the cold. The opening atmosphere feels both ceremonial and unsettling. It is as if we are being invited to attend not just a documentary, but a long-delayed vigil. The tower rises in the background like a silent witness, its grey walls and watchful turrets holding the memories of countless prisoners, yet somehow keeping a special corner of its silence for Anne. She was once a woman who wore jewels and fine fabrics, who walked in bright halls and heard her name called with respect and fear. Now, for most visitors, she is only a carved line on a stone and a story told in hushed tones by guides. And so the story begins here, in half darkness, with music lowered to a soft murmur, with red roses resting over hidden bones, and with a historian's calm voice promising to lead us back through time. We are not thrown into the chaos of Anne's arrest just yet. Instead, we are asked to slow down, to breathe more quietly, to feel the weight of the date, the 19th of May, year after year. Roses after roses. A queen remembered, a life taken, and a question still hanging in the air like incense. How did it come to this? Every year, on the 19th of May, something quiet and almost secret happens inside the chapel of the Tower of London. No trumpets sound, no crowd gathers, no ceremony is announced. A simple bouquet of red roses is delivered by an anonymous hand, accompanied only by a brief request that the flowers be laid gently on the exact spot where the second wife of Henry VIII, Queen Anne Boleyn, was buried after her execution on the 19th of May in the year 1536. No one signs the message. No one steps forward to claim this act of remembrance. The roses arrive, they are placed, and then the chapel falls back into its usual heavy silence. In that stone chapel, where light filters in softly through old glass and footsteps echo against the floor, the red of the roses seems to glow more deeply than it would anywhere else. Against the pale slabs of stone, their colour is almost startling, as if some small fragment of Anne's lost life has returned for a moment, breathing in the air of the present before sinking back into the past. Year after year, the same quiet ritual repeats. A queen long dead, a nameless giver, a handful of flowers marking the place where a head once fell, and a story seemed to come to an end. It is in this hushed, reverent atmosphere that a woman steps into view, historian Tracy Borman. Her voice is calm, unhurried, as if she understands that this is not a story to be rushed. She explains that, over the next 3 nights, she will tell the terrifying and heartbreaking tale of Anne Boleyn's downfall, not as a distant legend, not as a list of dates and names, but as a journey she will walk alongside Anne, as closely as time and evidence allow. She will follow Anne's path from a cherished queen to a hated outcast, and finally to a prisoner waiting for the sword. Tracy tells us that she will not be speaking only from books and documents, though those have been her companions for many years. This time she will follow in Anne's footsteps, moving through the very places Anne once knew. She will retrace, day by day and hour by hour, the 3 most important days in Anne's final chapter: the day of her arrest, the day of her trial, and the day of her execution. 3 days, 3 turning points, 3 steps down from the height of power into the darkness of the tower. She invites us to walk slowly beside her through each of those hours, to feel time tightening like a noose around Anne's life. The first episode, she explains, will be devoted to Anne's last day of freedom. It is a day that begins like any other for a queen. Familiar rooms, familiar faces, the reassuring rhythm of courtly life. Yet we, standing outside the story in the safety of the present, know what Anne does not, that every ordinary gesture, every casual word, is already balanced on the edge of disaster. By the time this day ends, Anne Boleyn will no longer be a free woman. For the first time in the history of England, a reigning queen will be arrested and taken to the Tower of London as a prisoner, facing charges so grave that the only possible punishment is death. As Tracy speaks, the camera of our imagination drifts back to the chapel. We see the roses resting on the stone, the faint outline of the place where Anne lies. There is no warm throne room here, no glittering jewels, no fine fabrics. There is just a name carved into cold stone, and a date that has been repeated softly, over and over, through the centuries. The 19th of May. Once, Anne walked through royal palaces, her head held high beneath a crown. Now, in this small corner of the tower, she is remembered by a few quiet words and a handful of flowers. The mood of this opening is both solemn and eerie, like standing on the threshold between waking and sleep. The red of the roses, the suggestion of distant music, the heavy outline of the tower against the sky, all of it feels like a slow, dark lullaby, drawing us gently into a story we already know will end in blood. The tower itself seems almost alive, a silent witness that has seen queens rise and fall, kings love and betray, oaths sworn and broken. It says nothing, yet its stones remember everything, including the moment when a young woman who once enchanted a king walked through its gates for the last time. And so, with Tracy's soft promise to guide us, the story begins. Not in chaos or shouting, but in a quiet chapel, with roses resting on a grave, and a date that refuses to be forgotten. A woman who once wore a crown is now only a name on a slab of stone. A life that once dazzled a court has shrunk into a ritual carried out in silence. From here, we will follow her, step by step, through the hours that took her from freedom to captivity, from hope to despair, from the bright halls of power to the shadowed heart of the tower. The message from Whitehall travels quietly along the river, gliding over the grey water of the Thames until it reaches Greenwich. It carries only one instruction, written with the authority that no one in England can ignore. By order of the King, Queen Anne must present herself immediately before the Privy Council. That name alone, the Privy Council, the highest advisory body in the realm, would have made her heart grow heavy. Nothing trivial is ever sent through them. The red of the roses, the suggestion of distant music, the heavy outline of the tower against the sky, all of it feels like a slow, dark lullaby, drawing us gently into a story we already know will end in blood. The tower itself seems almost alive, a silent witness that has seen queens rise and fall, kings love and betray, oaths sworn and broken. Anne, who has climbed higher than most women of her age could dream higher than they were ever permitted to climb now, stands precariously on a peak that many are eager to push her from. For 3 years, she has worn the crown, endured the stares, the praise, the hatred, the hopes, and for 3 years, many have watched her rise with clenched teeth, waiting for the moment when the tide might finally turn. The historian guiding us shows a letter written by the foreign ambassador Eustace Chapois, a man who has long despised Anne and has never hidden his contempt. In his letters, he calls her the concubine, the mistress, the woman who led the king astray from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. In this particular letter, Chapois writes that Henry is tiring of Anne, that he is already looking toward a younger woman, someone fresher, someone unspoiled by disappointment. He compares abandoning Anne to the pleasure a man feels when he rids himself of a thin, vicious old horse in hopes of finding a better, finer one to ride. Cruel words, but words that echo the mood of the English court. Almost no one speaks for Anne now. The murmurs turn against her, gathering like storm clouds ready to break. Meanwhile, at Greenwich, Anne is escorted from the tennis courts, the bright, lively part of the immense palace complex across the courtyard, where dozens of eyes follow her. The quiet rhythm of the morning has been shattered. She walks under the open sky toward the council chamber, her steps measured, her expression controlled. Every brick of the palace she traverses knows the weight she carries on her shoulders. Every window seems to watch her, waiting. Inside the council room stand 3 men, heavy-faced, rising to greet her as she enters. One of them is the Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, yet hardly her friend, one with whom she has shared more conflict than affection. Another is Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower of London, a man whose presence alone signals danger. Anne later recalled that she was cruelly handled there, scolded with a dismissive tut-tut, as though her fate were something trivial, something no more significant than a household misstep. But what comes next tears apart the thin veil of politeness. The council informs her that she is accused of adultery. Adultery with Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's closest friends, a man who has been loyal to Henry for many years. Adultery again with Mark Smeaton, a low-born musician, far beneath the social level of a queen. And adultery yet again with a third man whose name has not been given. The accusations fall like stones around her, each heavier than the last, each one capable of destroying not only her reputation but her life. For a moment, one can imagine the silence in the room stretching thin, cold, and suffocating. Anne must feel as if the floor beneath her has dropped away. Yet even in this sudden storm, she steadies herself. She does not scream, does not collapse. Instead, she speaks with a clarity born from instinct and fear. She insists that she is the king's true wife. She swears that no man has ever touched her. Innocence rises to her lips before anything else. Her first reaction, even in shock, even while surrounded by enemies, is to defend her honor, to cling to truth as though it were the last piece of solid ground left beneath her. Outside the chamber, murmurs begin to spread across the palace. But inside, the air remains thick, unmoving, charged with the knowledge that nothing will ever be the same again. Anne stands before the men who hold her fate in their hands, her crown invisible now, her position no longer a shield. And though she answers with grace, though she gathers what remains of her calm, the world around her has already shifted. The path that once led upward now slopes steeply downward, and the shadow of the tower has begun to stretch quietly toward her feet. Escorted out of the council chamber, Anne is led back across the wide courtyard of Greenwich Palace. The spring air feels colder now, the sky heavier, as if the world itself has shifted. Guards flank her on both sides, their steps firm and mechanical, and every eye in the courtyard seems to follow her. Servants pause in their work. Courtiers lean in to whisper behind gloved hands. No Queen of England had ever been paraded like this publicly, visibly, under suspicion of a crime that could cost her life. Her walk across the stones becomes a spectacle, a cruel procession that ensures no one in Greenwich remains unaware of her disgrace. Rumours spread faster than footsteps. By the time she reaches the entrance of her apartments, the entire palace seems to hum with speculation. Some faces look shocked, others uneasy, and a few, those who always resented her rise, cannot quite mask their satisfaction. Anne enters her chambers under armed guard, the sound of metal armor echoing through rooms once meant for comfort and authority. She stands for a moment, gathering herself, then moves with deliberate calm toward the table set for her midday meal. She sits beneath the canopy of a state, richly embroidered, gleaming with gold thread, a symbol reserved only for a reigning queen. It hovers above her head like an accusation now, a reminder of the power that is slipping away grain by grain, breath by breath. Her gown of deep red velvet and cloth of gold shimmers softly in the dim light, its magnificence contrasting painfully with the anxiety tightening the room around her. Her ladies-in-waiting hover nearby, their eyes swollen, their hands trembling. Some cry openly, unable to stop themselves. The atmosphere is thick with dread. Then comes the most unsettling absence of all. Normally, at meals, the king's server would appear to deliver a customary blessing, a short and familiar phrase spoken on behalf of Henry VIII. Much good may it do you. It was a ritual so routine that its absence feels louder than any accusation. Today, he does not come. The empty doorway seems to pulse with meaning. It is a small thing, just one man failing to enter a room, but it is enough to freeze the air around Anne's heart. She understands the message for what it is. The king has withdrawn his favour. The connection between them, a connection that once set kingdoms trembling, has begun to unravel. Anne tries to keep her composure. She lifts her cup, touches a piece of bread, attempts to follow the pattern of any ordinary meal. But her ladies watch her with faces full of fear, and their fear becomes her own. She feels the fragile mask she has worn all morning start to crack. Her breath grows uneven, her hands tremble. Her thoughts spin with too many questions and too few answers. She had entered this palace as Queen Henry's chosen woman, the mother of his daughter, the hope of his dynasty, and now she cannot even control the rise and fall of her own voice. Yet this moment, harsh as it is, did not erupt from nowhere. The tragedy tightening around her today began 3 months earlier, when she was carrying the child that was supposed to secure her future. The Tudor dynasty, fragile and desperate for stability, depended on a male heir. Henry's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon had collapsed after nearly 25 years without a living son. That failure haunted him, shaped him, drove him. And when he cast Catherine aside to take Anne, he did so with the conviction that Anne would give him what Catherine never could, a healthy prince. So when Anne became pregnant, the entire court whispered with expectation. This, they believed, was the moment destiny had promised. This was the child who would silence every critic, every rival, every ambassador who doubted her legitimacy. Henry and Anne themselves were so certain of a son that plans were set in motion long before the birth. Anne commissioned a commemorative medal to be minted, a gesture of triumph, a symbol she intended to distribute throughout the kingdom. The medal bore the words, "The Most Happy," celebrating the Queen who had finally given England its future king. Only one prototype still exists now, locked away in the British Museum. But in those early weeks, it represented everything Anne wanted the world to see: confidence, stability, triumph. The glow of her future seemed to shine through the metal, promising a new era under her motherhood. But the promise shattered. The pregnancy ended in miscarriage, and according to accounts, the lost child was a boy. The weight of that detail crushes everything. A prince gone. The heir the Tudor line so desperately needed lost before he could take a breath. For Henry, it was a blow that echoed his deepest fears. That his marriage to Anne was not blessed by God, that he had sinned in casting aside Catherine, that he had chosen the wrong woman to bear his legacy. Doubt began to corrode his faith in Anne. Whispers filled his ears. Regret slithered into his thoughts. And the king who once moved heaven and earth to have her began to imagine a life without her. Now, as Anne sits beneath the golden canopy, her hands shaking, her ladies crying, and the king's servant absent, she is feeling the full shadow of that loss. The storm that began with a single tragedy 3 months and one unborn son ago is now upon her, dark, vast, and merciless. And according to accounts, the lost child was a boy. The weight of that detail crushes everything. A prince gone. The heir the Tudor line so desperately needed lost before he could take a breath. For Henry, it was a blow that echoed his deepest fears. That his marriage to Anne was not blessed by God, that he had sinned in casting aside Catherine, that he had chosen the wrong woman to bear his legacy. Doubt began to corrode his faith in Anne. Whispers filled his ears. This, they believed, was the moment destiny had promised. This was the child who would silence every critic, every rival, every ambassador who doubted her legitimacy. Henry and Anne themselves were so certain of a son that plans were set in motion long before the birth. Anne commissioned a commemorative medal to be minted, a gesture of triumph, a symbol she intended to distribute throughout the kingdom. Later artists, working from memory or imagination, softened her features, altered her proportions, turned her into the tragic beauty people preferred to remember. But this medal preserves Anne as she truly was. Her heavy eyes, her firm jawline, her lifted chin suggesting confidence bordering on defiance. Tracy holds the medal gently, and in her voice there is a faint tremor. She imagines Anne doing the same, turning the small piece of metal in her hands, thinking of the future her child would bring. She imagines Henry touching it too, proud, certain that heaven had finally granted him the son he believed he deserved. But that imagined future shattered the moment Anne miscarried. The loss of the child, especially when witnesses later claimed it had been a boy, was more than a personal tragedy. For Henry, it felt like a divine omen, a spiritual rejection. He believed deeply that God communicated through fortune and misfortune, and when the hoped-for heir slipped away, he turned inward with suspicion. He remembered the 25 years he had spent married to Catherine of Aragon without a living son. He remembered the theological arguments he had used to justify abandoning her. And now, as he faced another failed male child, a fearful thought rose once again. What if God was punishing him? Rumours began spreading almost instantly. Some whispered that Anne had caused her own miscarriage through stress or rage. Others said the child had been malformed, an invention that would later be used to portray Anne as cursed or unnatural. But the most dangerous whispers were those that reached Henry's ears. That perhaps the problem was not his wife's health but his marriage itself. That God was withholding sons because Henry had chosen wrongly. The king, sensitive to signs and symbols, found himself sinking into the same cycle of doubt that had once torn apart his first marriage. For Anne, the miscarriage was the worst possible disaster. A male heir was her only true shield, in a court where affection changed like the wind. She had risen because Henry desired her. She remained queen because he still expected her to deliver the son he needed. Without that promise, her enemies long suppressed, but never defeated, began to move. They had waited for a moment of weakness, And now it had come. Whispers reached her that Henry had begun to take interest in other women, younger, gentler, unburdened by political battles or failed pregnancies. Some mentioned Jane Seymour, quiet and pale, serving in the Queen's household, everything Anne was not. Whether or not Henry had yet set his heart on another woman, the court believed he had. And in the Tudor world, belief was nearly as powerful as truth. Some whispered that Anne had caused her own miscarriage through stress or rage. Others said the child had been malformed, an invention that would later be used to portray Anne as cursed or unnatural. But the most dangerous whispers were those that reached Henry's ears. That perhaps the problem was not his wife's health but his marriage itself. That God was withholding sons because Henry had chosen wrongly. Then he began to gather threads, small comments, stray accusations, resentments from courtiers who had lost influence under Anne. Quietly, methodically, he wove these strands into something sharp and lethal. Cromwell was known as the Fixer, the one who solved the king's most delicate problems with clean, decisive strokes. Where others hesitated, he acted. Where others feared backlash, he embraced risk. Now, sensing the king's frustration, he began to shape a plan subtle enough to appear like justice, brutal enough to satisfy Henry's growing hunger for escape. Anne did not yet know it, but from the moment her child was lost, Cromwell had started clearing the path that would lead her toward the Tower. Her miscarriage marked the beginning of a steep descent, and Cromwell was already placing stones along the way, making sure she could not climb back up. In the quiet museum room, Tracy lets her fingers rest lightly on the glass above the medal. Once, it had symbolized hope. Now, it symbolizes a turning point, a moment when the future shifted, silently and irrevocably, toward tragedy. The scene shifts quietly to Austin Friars, once the nerve center of Thomas Cromwell's power, now swallowed beneath the steel and glass of modern London. The camera moves slowly through the space, as if brushing against the ghost of a house long vanished. In the 16th century, this was no ordinary residence, it was Cromwell's command post, the place where a blacksmith's son reshaped the entire political landscape of England, with nothing but intelligence, calculation, and an uncanny instinct for survival. Here, behind timbered walls and narrow Tudor windows, he rose from obscurity to become the chief architect of Henry VIII's will. Tracy Borman walks through the modern streets where Cromwell's home once stood, speaking softly, almost meditatively. She reminds us that Cromwell climbed the ladder not through noble birth, but through sheer force of mind. He promised Henry something no minister before him had delivered: unimaginable wealth. By engineering the dissolution of the monasteries, he had turned Henry into one of the richest monarchs England had ever seen. That alone secured his place at the king's side. But Cromwell was more than an administrator. He was a strategist, a fixer, someone who understood that power flows toward those who know how to bend truth into whatever shape the moment requires. To help explain this side of Cromwell, journalist Owen Jones steps into the frame. With a half smile, and the tone of someone who has watched many political storms unfold, he compares Cromwell to the modern world's most influential spin doctors. These are the advisors who work in shadows, crafting narratives, steering public opinion, and quietly turning scandals into stepping stones. Owen describes Cromwell as the founding father of this political species, a master of timing, manipulation, and ruthless efficiency. In his hands, politics was a chessboard, and every person, queen, courtier, enemy, or ally, was a piece to be moved, sacrificed, or protected, depending on the king's desires. He explains that men like Cromwell thrive on danger. They are, in his words, adrenaline seekers, drawn to the thrill of decisions that could topple them at any moment. They know the stakes. They understand the risks. But they keep going because the pull of power, the ability to change the course of a nation with a signature or a whisper, is too intoxicating to resist. Cromwell lived in that danger willingly. He had no noble lineage to fall back on if he failed. His entire life depended on staying indispensable to Henry. And now, in the spring of the year 1536, Cromwell sensed that the king's sacred objective had changed. Henry no longer wanted a religious reformation or political consolidation. His new objective was simpler, darker, more personal. He wanted to rid himself of his second wife, Queen Anne Boleyn. Cromwell had helped Henry dismantle his 25-year marriage to Catherine of Aragon when the king lost patience with her. He had orchestrated her downfall carefully, removing her influence, cutting off her supporters, isolating her until she became powerless. Now, with brutal symmetry, he was prepared to do the same to Anne. The moment Henry's affection faltered, Cromwell did not hesitate. His allegiance was not to queens, it was to the king alone. As Anne's fortunes declined, Cromwell began gathering threads of accusation, weaving them together into a tapestry dark enough to obscure the truth. He collected gossip whispered in corridors. He listened to courtiers who resented Anne's sharp tongue. He noted every slight, every rumour, every misinterpreted glance. Witnesses willing or coerced were assembled. A narrative was shaped. And slowly, quietly, a case began to form, like frost spreading across glass. Anne's appearance before the Privy Council earlier that day had been merely the opening move. Cromwell understood Henry's temperament better than anyone. His rage flared suddenly, but his heart softened just as quickly. Henry and Anne had always clashed fiercely, then reconciled with equal passion. If Cromwell waited too long, the king might change his mind again. He might forgive Anne. He might dismiss the accusations. And then Cromwell, who had already begun the machinery of her downfall, would be exposed his own life hanging by the same fragile thread. So everything had to move quickly. Every step of the process, the interrogation, the accusations, the whispers, the arrests, was designed to close around Anne before she could plead, explain, or recover the king's affection. Cromwell operated with icy urgency. He understood that hesitation was the enemy. And so, beneath the roofs of Austin Friars, plans were drawn with chilling precision. The Queen was being boxed in corner by corner, hour by hour, until her fate could no longer slip from his grasp. As the scene fades, the house that once stood there seems to breathe for a moment in the dim light, an invisible monument to the man who, in less than a week, would reshape the destiny of a queen. The midday light at Greenwich lies heavy and still when the door to Anne's chamber opens, and the quiet air she has tried so hard to control shatters. She has barely managed a few bites of her meal food that tastes of nothing when Thomas Cromwell steps inside. He is not alone. A cluster of powerful men follows him, their faces solemn, their eyes set firmly on her. Among them is the Duke of Norfolk, her uncle by blood but never by affection, a man whose alliance has always been with power, never with family. In Norfolk's hands is a tightly rolled scroll of parchment, sealed and unmistakable. Even before he speaks, the meaning is clear. The room seems to contract. The golden cloth of state above Anne's head sways almost imperceptibly, as if reacting to the shift in the world beneath it. Anne rises slowly, her movements graceful even now. Her voice is steady when she asks why they have come. Norfolk does not soften the blow. "We come by the king's command," he says, his tone cold, almost practiced, "to conduct the Queen to the Tower of London." The words fall into the room like a stone dropped into deep water, sending shockwaves through everyone present. The Tower. The fortress where prisoners of the state await judgment. The place where traitors are housed. The place where executions are carried out. For Anne, it must land like a blow to the stomach, hard, sudden, breath-stealing. The Tower is not a place for queens. No Queen of England has ever been taken there as a prisoner. The enormity of it presses in on her all at once. And yet, she does not collapse. She does not scream. She does not beg. Instead, she straightens, draws in a breath that is thin but controlled, and replies quietly, "If it be His Majesty's pleasure, then I am ready to obey." Oh, it is a moment of calm that defies everything unfolding around her. But beneath that thin layer of composure, the reality is merciless. She is not allowed to gather her belongings. She is not allowed to summon her closest ladies. She is not allowed to say goodbye to her daughter, little Elizabeth, barely 2.5 years old, who will have no memory of the last moment she saw her mother free. Everything happens quickly, brutally, without mercy. This speed is no accident. Cromwell knows Henry's nature well. The king's emotions are storms violent, overwhelming, but capable of clearing just as suddenly as they appear. Henry and Anne have a history of quarrels that end in fierce reconciliations. If they are allowed to speak even once, if Anne is allowed to weep before him, or Henry sees her pain, everything Cromwell has built could crumble. The king might forgive. He might hesitate. He might change his mind. Cromwell cannot risk that, so he moves with precision, sealing off every possible path between husband and wife. The doorways close. The courtiers tighten their ranks. The queen is surrounded by guards before she can even form a plan. In a matter of minutes, she is no longer Anne the queen, but Anne the prisoner. Outside, the palace murmurs like a waking hive. Word spreads quickly, a ripple of disbelief and thrill. Windows open. Footsteps gather. Servants find excuses to linger in corridors. Everyone senses that history is tilting, that something unprecedented is happening, something that will be spoken of in whispers for generations. Anne, escorted by guards, is led through the familiar halls of Greenwich for what she does not know will be the last time. She walks toward the river, where a barge waits to carry her along the Thames. The same river that once carried her toward coronation celebrations now waits to carry her toward confinement. She steps forward because she must. Behind her, doors close with the sound of finality. Meanwhile, at Whitehall, the king stays hidden. Henry does not come to see her, does not attempt a farewell, does not even show himself to the court. He avoids the public eye with a strange, deliberate absence. Whether it is cowardice, coldness, or calculation, no one can say. But his disappearance speaks louder than any proclamation. Anne will face her fate alone. The barge waits on the water, dark and silent, its oarsmen ready. In a few moments, Anne will step inside and begin the slow journey up the Thames to the Tower of London, the place where queens do not go unless they are never meant to return. From this moment on, her crown may still rest on her head, but her freedom is gone. Her fate has been taken from her hands and placed into the machinery of power, ambition, and fear. And as the river waits, the sky above seems to dim, as if preparing itself for the tragedy about to unfold. While Anne waits under guard at Greenwich, confined within rooms that were once symbols of her triumph, the atmosphere across the river at Whitehall could not be more different. There, Henry VIII moves through his palace with an energy that seems disturbingly out of place. He avoids any encounter with his wife, stays hidden from public audiences, yet those few who see him report a mood almost celebratory. Some describe him as in excellent spirits, others as behaving as though rejoicing in the Queen's misfortune. For those who witness it, the contrast is jarring, ghastly even. As Anne faces humiliation, fear, and the unknown, the king hosts feasts, entertains ladies, laughs loudly, and often remains in company until well after midnight. The court, sensing the shift of power, follows his lead and becomes noisier, busier, more uncomfortably cheerful. It is as though Henry has already extracted himself emotionally from the marriage, long before any legal or formal end. His absence from Greenwich speaks volumes. His sudden ease, his lively conversations, his indulgent dinners, all of it suggests that, in his mind, Anne is no longer his queen. She has become a problem removed, a burden lifted, a chapter already closed. For many watching, the king's behaviour is not just indecent, it is chilling. A man who once rearranged the religious structure of England to possess Anne now seems almost relieved to be rid of her. The documentary pauses here to pose an important question. If Henry now appears so cold, so detached, then what was it years ago that ignited his obsession for Anne Boleyn? What was the force strong enough to push him to challenge the Pope himself, to defy the Vatican, to sever England from centuries of Catholic tradition? What held such power over a king that he would risk his soul, his crown, and the stability of his realm? To explore this, Tracy Borman returns to the symbol forged during Anne's brief moment of triumph, the Most Happy Medal. The original, though damaged, still exists, and the sculptor Lucy Churchill has used it to reconstruct a three-dimensional likeness of Anne's face. When Tracy is shown the recreated image, an image based not on legend or later romanticized portraits, but on the only likeness created during Anne's lifetime, her first reaction is one of quiet astonishment. This Anne is not the ethereal beauty described in novels or painted in Victorian fantasies. She is real, tangible, imperfect. Her eyes are heavy-lidded, giving her a serious, contemplative expression. Her jawline is firm, perhaps even strong to the point of severity, features that many in the Tudor court described dismissively. Some accounts even said she was not the most beautiful woman at court. And yet, as Lucy Churchill explains, beauty was not the source of Anne's magnetism. Her power lay elsewhere. Anne was electric in motion, an exceptional dancer, graceful and confident, drawing eyes without demanding them. She was intelligent in a world that feared intelligent women. She was witty, quick with words, able to charm or disarm with equal ease. She spoke elegantly, thought rapidly, and carried herself with a confidence that bordered on sovereign even before she became queen. And, perhaps most importantly, she possessed a kind of charisma that could not be painted or sculpted, a spark that made her unforgettable to those who encountered her. Lucy draws attention to the posture seen on the medal, Anne's back straight, her head raised, her chin lifted just slightly, in a way that signals certainty rather than arrogance. Her hands rest at her sides in a stance reminiscent of royal command, giving her the air of a woman who knows her value and is unafraid to show it. This small piece of metal, crafted in the early months of her pregnancy, captures Anne not as she is remembered in tragedy, but as she truly was at the height of her influence. Self-assured, formidable, and glowing with the promise of a future she believed she would shape. This, Lucy explains, is the Anne Henry fell for. Not a flawless beauty, not a submissive court lady, but a woman with presence vibrant, ambitious, intellectually alive. A woman who challenged him, teased him, intrigued him. A woman unlike any he had ever known. As the reconstructed face turns slowly under the museum lights, Tracy seems almost entranced by it. In the soft glow, the features that once enchanted a king come alive again, not because of perfection, but because of force, because of personality, because of the confidence that shone through her eyes long before any crown touched her head. And so the documentary reminds us gently, the tragedy unfolding now, with Henry feasting while Anne waits in fear, began long ago with passion just as fierce. The flames that once burned bright enough to divide a kingdom are now embers, cooling rapidly. But the heat they once released reshaped the very structure of England. Soon, that heat will turn cold entirely, and Anne, whose spirit once lit Henry's world so vividly, will face the last stage of her descent alone. The story returns to Greenwich, where the quiet dread inside Anne's chambers gives way to the open air and the wide, indifferent river waiting beyond. Guards gather around her, forming a rigid wall of steel and authority, and she is led from her private rooms toward the Thames. The descent begins slowly, step by step, down the ancient stone stairs that still survive in fragments today. Tracy Borman walks along those very steps, pointing gently toward the place where, on this day, in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn was brought down to the riverbank, not as queen, but as a captive. At the front of the procession walks Thomas Cromwell. His presence is unmistakable. He is not merely supervising the arrest, he is orchestrating it. The man who built the trap now leads his captive through it. His eyes remain fixed ahead, but his shadow hangs over Anne like a verdict already spoken. There is no softness in his step, no hesitation. He intends to deliver her personally to the Tower, unwilling to trust anyone else with the final piece of his plan. The Thames lies below, murky and restless. A barge waits at the water's edge, its hull dark, its oarsmen silent. This is no ceremonial royal barge with banners and musicians. It is a prison boat. The image is stark. A queen being guided toward a vessel that will carry her not to a palace but to confinement. Traditionally, state prisoners were taken under the cover of night, moved discreetly, hidden from public eyes, their shame tucked away in shadow. But Anne Boleyn is afforded no such courtesy. Instead, her journey is arranged for broad daylight. The decision is deliberate. They want her fall to be witnessed. They want whispers to bloom into shouts. They want the kingdom to see that the woman who once displaced Catherine of Aragon now suffers a humiliation greater than any Catherine ever endured. As Anne steps into the barge, the air seems to thicken. The boat rocks gently, a reminder that nothing beneath her feet is stable anymore. Not the river, not the crown, not her future. Cromwell boards as well, seating himself close enough to ensure she cannot escape his gaze. It is an unspoken declaration. He will watch her downfall with his own eyes from beginning to end. The oars dip into the water, and the long journey begins 2 slow, heavy hours along the Thames. Today, the river glides quietly through a modern city, but in the spring of 1536, it was a bustling artery of boats, merchants, ferries, and noise. The Thames was London's great highway, and it carried news as swiftly as it carried people. Cromwell's agents have already done their work. By the time the barge drifts into the central stretch of the river, the rumour is everywhere. The Queen of England has been arrested. and is being taken to the tower. Crowds gather along the banks, leaning over wooden railings, pointing, murmuring, some craning their necks in morbid excitement. Many in the crowd still hold loyalty to Catherine of Aragon, believing Anne stole the crown unjustly. For them, this sight feels like divine justice, the settling of a long open wound. For Anne, the hostility pressing in from both sides of the river must feel suffocating. Strangers glare at her, whisper her name with disdain, spit curses under their breath. Some cross themselves as she passes, as if she carries a curse. And above it all, Cromwell sits motionless, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than any accusation. The boat glides onward, the oars cutting a steady rhythm into the water. As they approach the tower, the sky seems to dim, the air colder. The fortress rises from the riverbank, and from this angle, from the low perspective of a boat, it appears larger, harsher, more merciless than ever. People who approach the tower by land never quite see its full severity, but from the river, it looms like a giant stone beast, heavy walls, sharp battlements, ancient towers leaning over the water as though waiting for their next prey. Anne lifts her eyes and sees it. The Tower of London, grey, massive, unmoving, a fortress that has been the last sight of countless condemned souls. From below, it resembles a great stone mouth, dark, wide, unyielding, ready to swallow her whole. The barge slows. The oars rise, dripping from the river. The water laps against the hull in a slow, uneasy rhythm. Anne stands because she must. Every step she takes toward the landing feels like walking deeper into shadow. Behind her, the sun glints faintly on the river. Ahead of her, the tower waits in silence. She is no longer simply Anne Boleyn, the woman who once captivated a king. She is the prisoner of the crown, arriving at the gates of her fate. Most prisoners who arrived at the Tower of London entered through the Watergate known grimly as Traitor's Gate. It was the passage reserved for the condemned, the disgraced, the forgotten, those whose names would soon be scratched out of history. But Anne Boleyn, even in the darkest hour of her life, was still the Queen of England. Her crown had not yet been formally stripped away. And so, in a final, bitter gesture of protocol, she was not taken through Traitor's Gate, but through Court Gate, the entrance traditionally used by royalty. A privilege, yes, but one that cut more deeply than an outright humiliation, because it reminded her of everything she stood to lose. As Anne's feet touched the landing, the tower's cannons thundered into the air. Once, those booms had been reserved to honor visiting dignitaries, foreign princes, kings, or queens arriving in triumph. But on this day, this bleak 2nd of May in the year 1536, the cannons roared to acknowledge the arrival of a prisoner. Their echo rolled across the water, solemn and distorted, amplifying the cruelty of her fall. Even the stones of the fortress seemed to tremble with it. Anne, known for her remarkable composure, could no longer hold herself together. The mask she had worn so bravely at Greenwich shattered the moment she stepped inside the tower's shadow. She dropped to her knees on the cold stone and burst into tears, insisting again and again that she was innocent. Her voice, trembling but clear, carried the same desperate certainty she had spoken in the council chamber. I am the king's true wife. Now, though, her words dissolved into sobs. 3 years earlier, she had come to this very place in triumph. The memory struck her like a blade. Then, the tower had welcomed her with banners fluttering in the wind, music echoing through its courtyards, and crowds cheering the arrival of England's new queen. She had lodged in the royal chambers, dined in splendour, walked beneath arches hung with cloth of gold as she prepared for her coronation procession. Now the same walls loomed above her as prison walls. The same walkways that once celebrated her rise now enclosed her fall. Every footstep she took felt like a cruel reversal, a reminder of how quickly a crown could turn into a noose. Because Anne had not yet been formally deposed, she was still entitled, at least on paper, to the treatment of a queen. Therefore, her custody fell under the authority of Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower. Kingston, a dutiful man bound more to his office than to emotion, greeted her with stiff politeness. But even formality offered no comfort here. The tower had swallowed too many souls to ever feel gentle. Anne, shaking and exhausted, looked up at him and asked the question that had been clawing at her since her arrest. "Mr. Kingston, shall I go into a dungeon?" Her voice was small, fragile, the voice of a woman preparing herself for darkness, chains, and the suffocating cold of a cell carved into the tower's ancient walls. She imagined iron shackles, the stench of damp air, straw-covered floors, rats moving in the shadows. But Kingston shook his head. Instead of leading her downward, toward the infamous dungeons, he began to guide her in the opposite direction toward the inner ward, toward the grand building that had once housed royal guests. These were the Queen's apartments, a lavish space restored only 3 years earlier for her coronation. Anne blinked in disbelief as she followed him, her tears slowing in confusion. She was being taken not to a pit of punishment, but to a suite of richly furnished rooms. It made no sense. The world had turned upside down. She was accused of treason, of adultery, of crimes punishable by death. She had been dragged from Greenwich under guard, shamed before courtiers, delivered in daylight to the most feared prison in England. And yet here she was, being shown into chambers hung with tapestries, warmed with fine carpets, lit by windows that looked out on the Tower grounds. Rooms fit for a queen, though she was a queen in name only now. The contradiction gnawed at her. Was this a sign of mercy? A sign of lingering affection from Henry? Or was it part of a crueler design granting her comfort only to rip it away later? Kingston noted in his report that upon entering the apartments, Anne exclaimed, "It is too good for me." Her words hung in the air, uncertain, trembling, almost bewildered. Was it humility? Was it fear? Or was it the disoriented mind of a woman who could no longer tell whether she was being protected or prepared for destruction? The tower was full of secrets, of shadows, of histories steeped in blood. But none of it had ever confused Anne Boleyn as much as this moment, the moment she discovered she was being treated like a queen even as she was being tried like a traitor. Suspended between honor and death, she stepped into the rooms where she would await judgment, her heart racing, her mind spiraling, her fate already tightening around her like invisible chains. Using a detailed Tudor-era map, Tracy Borman slowly traces the outline of a vanished building, the Queen's lodgings, within the Tower complex. Though nothing remains of them now but patches of lawn and stones buried beneath centuries of soil, the map reveals precisely where Anne Boleyn once walked, slept, and wept. In Anne's time, this was no damp cell or bleak chamber. It was a newly rebuilt palace wing, stretching from the White Tower to the outer wall, restored lavishly at Henry's command for her coronation just 3 years earlier. Henry had spent £35,000 on these apartments, an astonishing sum, equal to roughly £1.5 million today. Every beam, tapestry and carved panel had been crafted to honour Anne as the dazzling new Queen of England. Now, those same rooms had become her gilded prison. When Anne first stepped inside, seeing the fine hangings and the grandeur that still clung to the space, she cried out through her tears, "It is too good for me." The sentence hangs strangely between humility and despair. Some who later heard of it wondered if she was hinting at guilt, an unconscious confession. Others thought she was desperately trying to appear meek, hoping for sympathy. But Kingston, the constable of the Tower, had recorded the moment precisely. Anne fell to her knees, sobbing violently, and then suddenly burst into loud, uncontrollable laughter. The cycle repeated, crying, then laughing, then crying again, as though her mind was slipping between terror and denial. It is a portrait of a woman pushed to the edge of psychological collapse. She was exhausted, humiliated, and terrified. Everything had unravelled with such speed that her thoughts could not keep up. Within hours, she had gone from queen to prisoner, from mother of a future prince to a woman accused of treason and adultery. Her tears were understandable, but her laughter was what unsettled the observers. It was the kind of laughter that comes when the mind cannot bear the weight of reality, and Cromwell expected exactly this. He needed Anne unstable, frightened, desperate. Panic leads to mistakes. Fear leads to slips of the tongue. And Cromwell had already prepared the perfect trap. 4 women were assigned to attend Anne in the Queen's lodgings. Women she disliked, women she did not trust, women she certainly would not confide in. Even worse, one of them was her own aunt. Yet family meant nothing now. Loyalty to the king outweighed blood, affection, and history. These attendants were not placed there to offer comfort. They were spies. Cromwell had hand-picked them. Their job was to observe everything. Every tear Anne shed, every sigh, every muttered comment, every confused question. They were to record her words, her tone, even her silences. If she lamented her situation, they would write it down. If she expressed fear, they would report it. If she spoke a single sentence that could be twisted, misinterpreted, or rearranged into something incriminating, Cromwell would seize upon it like a blade. For the charges against her were still fragile. They needed strengthening. He needed more than rumours to bring down a queen. And so, Anne was surrounded not by comfort, but by ears. The women watched as she paced the chamber in agitation. They sat silently as she wrung her hands and whispered prayers. They stood near her bed and listened as she cried through the night. Every word she spoke out of sorrow, fear, or delirium was carefully noted and delivered to Cromwell. Anne could not speak without being overheard. She could not weep without being witnessed. She could not think aloud without risking the thought becoming evidence. The Queen's apartments, built at enormous cost to crown her in glory, had become a cage of velvet and gold. But the luxury only deepened the cruelty. It reminded her of the woman she had been 3 years earlier, celebrated, envied, triumphant, and contrasted it painfully with the woman she now was, isolated, watched, and betrayed. Tracy Borman pauses in her narration to let this sink in. The rooms that once symbolized Anne's ascent were now instruments of her destruction. Their splendor did not protect her. Their comfort did not soothe her. Their size did not offer freedom. They served only to highlight that she was a queen in title alone, and a prisoner in every other sense. Cromwell's net had tightened. The 4 attendants were his eyes and ears, extensions of his will. Every breath Anne took inside these walls would be monitored. Every movement would be recorded. Every weakness would be exploited. And as night settled over the tower, Anne Boleyn lay within her lavish prison, surrounded by traitors masquerading as attendants, wondering which whispered word would become the thread Cromwell used to unravel her life. Their job was to observe everything. Every tear Anne shed, every sigh, every muttered comment, every confused question. They were to record her words, her tone, even her silences. If she lamented her situation, they would write it down. If she expressed fear, they would report it. If she spoke a single sentence that could be twisted, misinterpreted, or rearranged into something incriminating, Cromwell would seize upon it like a blade. For the charges against her were still fragile. But in the court's shadowy corridors, that unnamed figure is already taking shape, and the rumour hardens into something far more dangerous. Whispers begin to ripple across London that the mysterious third man is none other than George Boleyn, Anne's younger brother. George hears the rumour swiftly. News travels like lightning through a court on edge. Horrified, refusing to believe Cromwell would sink so low, he mounts his horse and rides urgently toward the palace, which once stood near the modern government buildings of London. He hopes for one thing only: an audience with the king. If he can speak to Henry directly, explain, appeal, defend his family perhaps, he can break through the web of lies tightening around his sister. But he never makes it past the palace doors. Cromwell has already moved to isolate Henry completely. The king is surrounded by his inner circle, shielded from petitions, protected from interruptions. No one gets close unless Cromwell allows it, and Cromwell will not allow this meeting. George does not reach Henry. He does not get the chance to defend Anne. Instead, he is seized on the spot. The charge read to him is not merely adultery, it is incest. The word is so monstrous, so outrageous, that even in a court accustomed to scandal, it sends shockwaves through those who hear it. Adultery might tarnish a queen's virtue, but incest? That transforms her into something unnatural, depraved, morally unthinkable. It is the kind of accusation designed not just to destroy a reputation, but to obliterate it completely, leaving nothing behind but revulsion. This is Cromwell's masterstroke. If Anne is accused of lying with her own brother, then the entire narrative shifts. She is no longer simply an unfaithful wife. She becomes a symbol of corruption, a woman whose sins are so grotesque that no punishment seems too extreme. For the public, for the nobles, for the church, such an accusation poisons even the thought of defending her. And crucially, it gives Cromwell the final tool he needs, a crime so shocking that Henry cannot possibly reconcile with her again. From his command centre at Austin Friars, Cromwell watches these developments unfold like pieces falling neatly into place. The Queen is securely held in the Tower. Henry Norris, once the king's closest friend, is under arrest. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, has been interrogated relentlessly, likely coerced, possibly tortured into a confession Cromwell can wield as he pleases. And now, George Boleyn has been dragged into the net, charged with a crime so vile it ensures public outrage. Everything is aligning. Cromwell moves through these events with the quiet certainty of a man who has calculated every angle. Each arrest is another knot in the rope. Each rumour is another stitch holding the case together. He knows that to remove a queen, especially one with supporters, charm, and a royal child, requires more than mere suspicion. It requires spectacle. It requires disgust. It requires accusations so severe the kingdom itself recoils. And so he builds exactly that. In the Tower, Anne paces her richly furnished prison, unaware that outside the walls a far darker tragedy is unfolding. Her thoughts whirl between denial and hope, terror and disbelief. She knows the charges of adultery are lies. She knows Henry Norris would never betray the king. She knows Mark Smeaton's confession must have been forced. But she cannot imagine, cannot even conceive that her own brother has been accused of the same crimes. She cannot fathom that George has been arrested, questioned, and condemned in the same breath as herself. She does not yet know that the net closing around her is woven not just of rumours, but of family. Her brother's fate is now bound to hers. His fall will mirror her own. And his arrest signals something unmistakable. Cromwell does not want doubt. He does not want debate. He does not want nuance. He wants annihilation. And Anne, locked within the tall stone walls of the Tower, still clinging to scraps of hope, does not yet realise that the story has already moved beyond rescue. The machine Cromwell set in motion is gathering speed, and soon it will carry both siblings to the same irreversible destination. The Tower doors close around her, muffling the distant sounds of London. Somewhere far away, George Boleyn is also imprisoned, waiting, frightened, bewildered, and neither of them knows that the trial being prepared for them has only one possible ending. An ending Cromwell has already written. Cromwell understood perfectly the lesson Henry had learned too late from his first marriage. Catherine of Aragon, though set aside and forced from court, had refused to vanish quietly. She never surrendered the title True Queen, never accepted the annulment, never acknowledged Anne as her successor. In the eyes of the English people, Catherine remained the rightful queen until her death. Her resilience created a long-lasting political wound, a symbol of resistance that haunted Henry for years. It was the one thing he could not shake: Catherine's moral superiority. And Cromwell was determined never to let that happen again. Anne Boleyn, unlike Catherine, was not beloved by the populace. She had enemies, many of them. Her sharp tongue and political assertiveness had offended nobles, diplomats, and factions across the realm. Yet she still held influence. She still had powerful relations. She still had supporters, especially among reformers who saw her as a beacon of religious change. If Henry simply divorced her, or annulled the marriage, those supporters could stir rebellion, dispute royal legitimacy, or challenge the succession of the next queen. So, in Cromwell's mind, a gentle ending, a quiet removal, was not an option. He needed erasure, not just political removal, but moral annihilation. Anne had to be transformed into a figure so tainted, so monstrous, so utterly disgraced that no one, neither commoner nor noble, would dare defend her memory. She had to fall not as a queen, but as a criminal. To achieve that, Cromwell needed more than suspicion. He needed a spectacle. He had already set the stage. Sir Henry Norris had been arrested. Mark Smeaton had confessed under heavy pressure, and George Boleyn had been dragged into the accusations with charges of incest. An accusation crafted not merely to condemn him, but to poison Anne's very image. These were pillars of Tudor society, ambitious, educated, well-connected men. Their downfall served a purpose. If such prominent figures could be accused and destroyed, then Anne's destruction would feel inevitable, even justified. Across London, one by one, doors of power began to shut to anyone who might have supported her. Courtiers sensed danger and stepped back. Ambassadors wrote carefully, aligning themselves with whatever direction the political wind blew. Reformists who had once praised Anne retreated into silence. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, abandoned her entirely. Even her father distanced himself, bowing to survival rather than loyalty. The Boleyn family, once rising meteors in the Tudor court, was collapsing in slow motion. Cromwell's strategy was working. Now came the final, decisive task: preparing a trial unlike any England had ever seen. A trial in which a reigning queen, not a widow, not a former consort, but a crowned monarch, would stand accused of treason, adultery, and incest before a jury of nobles. A trial designed not to seek truth, but to legitimize a verdict determined long before any evidence was presented. A trial that would drag down not only Anne, but the men around her, creating a public execution of reputations before the real execution took place. It would be, as history remembers it, the trial of the century. A chilling message needed to be carved into the collective memory of England. To betray the king, or even to be suspected of it, is to die, and Cromwell would make sure the message was unmistakably clear. Meanwhile, only a short distance from Austin Friars, close enough that Cromwell could almost hear the tower's bells if he paused to listen, Anne Boleyn sat in her richly furnished prison, folding into the long shadows of her first night as a captive. She tried to understand her situation, tried to grasp the shape of the accusations, tried to hold on to a thread of hope, but every emotion, fear, anger, confusion pressed into her mind until sleep became impossible. She clung to the belief that Henry might yet intervene, that he would not let the mother of his daughter face ruin. She believed the accusations too absurd to stand. She believed the king would eventually see reason. She did not know, could not know, that Cromwell had already written every line of the script. The arrests, the interrogations, the spies positioned in her chamber, the structure of the court that would judge her, the witnesses recruited, coerced, or manufactured, the charges escalating with each passing hour. Outside her chamber, London breathed normally, unaware of the silent machinery assembling behind closed doors. Inside the tower, Anne lay awake, alone, listening to the stone walls hum with the weight of centuries. She felt fear rising like water around her, but she did not yet understand the shape of the trap. She did not know that Cromwell had built a case intended not just to condemn, but to erase. She did not know that the gears had already locked into place. She did not know that the next days would carry her, step by step, toward a verdict already decided. And she did not know that even as she drifted into an uneasy half-sleep, the plan to destroy her was entering its final, irreversible stage. Night settles over the Tower of London like a heavy cloak, thickening the silence and pressing against the stone walls that have witnessed centuries of fear, betrayal, and endings. The air grows colder, the corridors darker, the weight of the place sinking deeper into Anne's bones. It is her first night imprisoned, not as queen, not as consort, but as a woman awaiting judgment she cannot yet see. Sir William Kingston, dutiful and impassive, visits her in the evening. His footsteps echo through the Queen's lodgings before he appears at her door, and Anne rises instinctively, as if still performing the role she once embodied. She repeats what she has insisted since the moment of her arrest, that she is innocent, that she is the King's true wedded wife, and that no man has ever touched her dishonourably. Her voice trembles, but her words remain firm-spoken with the deep conviction of someone who cannot comprehend how the world has twisted so violently against her. Then she asks Kingston the question that has been gnawing at her since dawn. "Do you know wherefore I am here?" Kingston answers softly, "No." But whether that is truth or a performance of duty, no one knows. His loyalty is to the office he serves, not the prisoner before him, and so he offers nothing. No explanation, no comfort, no clarity. Desperation begins to seep through Anne's composure. She asks after those who might have spoken for her, who might intervene, who might carry a message of loyalty to the king. Most of all, she asks about her father, Thomas Boleyn, the man who once pushed both his daughters toward the crown. Surely he at least would try to save her, but Kingston has no reassurance to give. The truth is far harsher. Thomas Boleyn has retreated into silence. He has chosen survival over loyalty, self-preservation over compassion. He will not risk his own position or his own head to defend his daughter. And so Anne faces the storm alone, abandoned even by the blood that should have stood beside her. Across the city, in Whitehall Palace, the king withdraws to his private chambers. The palace is lit with torches, warmed by fires, attended by servants, yet Henry VIII is alone. His wife is in the tower. His court is humming with whispers. His advisors are preparing the machinery of destruction, and Henry retreats into solitude. As the night deepens, Cromwell sends a written report to the king, an update on the accusations, a neat summary of the charges, a reminder that the case against Anne is advancing swiftly. When Henry reads it, he is said to have wept. A witness later reported that the king burst into tears. But the documentary asks the question that hangs heavy in the dimly lit air. Were those tears real? Or were they the tears of a man grieving, not for his wife, but for himself, for the humiliation he believed he had suffered, for the trust he believed had been betrayed, for the image of himself as a wronged husband, rather than a man who had abandoned a woman he once moved heaven and earth to possess? Perhaps Henry cried because he felt wounded. Perhaps he cried because he felt trapped. Perhaps he cried because it was easier to imagine he had been deceived than to face the reality that he had grown weary of the woman he had elevated to a throne. Whatever the truth, one fact remains unaltered. Anne spends the first night away from Henry not as his queen, but as a prisoner. Within the tower, the stone walls seem to close around her. The wind rattles against narrow windows. Footsteps echo in distant corridors. The past seems to whisper from every corner of kings and traitors, of coronations and executions, of those who walked in alive and left only in memory. Anne lies awake, the darkness thick around her, the reality settling like frost on her skin. She once called herself the most happy. She once believed herself destined to reshape England. She once believed Henry's love would protect her from any danger. Now, all of that feels like a distant dream. She is alone. She is watched. She is judged before she has spoken a word. And the tower, cold, ancient, indifferent, holds her tightly in its grasp, as the first night of her downfall stretches endlessly into silence. As we come to the end of Anne's final day of freedom, let the pace of the story soften. Let the shadows in the tower grow a little quieter, and allow your mind to drift gently away from the harshness of Tudor politics towards something calmer, slower, and lighter. Imagine the tower now, not as the cold fortress that held Anne captive, but as a silhouette softened by nightfall, its stone walls no longer looming, just resting under the dim glow of the moon. The echoes fade, the whispered accusations dissolve, and the heavy footsteps of guards become nothing more than distant ripples folding into the silence. In this softened darkness, the figure of Anne herself also begins to blur, her fear loosening, her trembling breaths growing slower, her thoughts settling like dust on old stone. You may picture her not as a queen undone by cruelty, but as a woman finally slipping into a fragile rest, the world outside her chamber fading to nothing but gentle night. And in that quiet, we begin to understand the heart of her story. It is a reminder that power is fragile, that fortunes rise and fall like tides, and that even those who shine the brightest can be dimmed by forces far beyond their control. It teaches us something tender, too, that behind every legend is a human being, someone who hoped, who feared, who trusted too deeply, someone who stood strong until she could no longer stand. Anne's story holds a truth that touches all of us, that courage does not always roar, and sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply endure the darkness with grace. And as we let her image fade peacefully into the night, as we step back from these winding corridors of history, I want you to feel your own breathing slow, your shoulders loosen, your mind drift a little further from the noise of the day. Because the story is ending now, and all that remains is a soft, gentle quiet. So, my dear listener, let the last echoes fall away. Let the tower melt into darkness, and let this whispered moment of stillness wrap around you like a warm blanket. Thank you for staying with me through this journey, through the rise and fall of a woman who changed an empire simply by being herself. If this story touched you, if it soothed you, if it carried you gently into the night, then I hope you will subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories yet to come. Stories filled with history, emotion, and the soft, sleepy calm we share together. A peaceful, restful, quiet good night to you.